She arrived at that question with a tin cup in one hand and a lantern in the other, and she did not know yet that it would change the shape of her whole life. The wind had teeth that November, the kind that found its way through cracked shutters and worn coats. And Josephine had long since stopped expecting anything from the world beyond another cold morning and another debt she could not pay. But there was a sound coming from the barn that night, low and ragged, and she walked toward it the way a woman walks toward trouble she has already decided to face. He was lying in the straw with blood gone dark on his shirt, a stranger with a ranger's badge and no name he offered right away. She could have left him. Everyone would have understood if she had. A woman alone, a ranch already failing, a man she owed nothing to and had never seen before that hour. There was no shortage of reasons to close the barn door and walk back to the house. Instead, she knelt down beside him, not over him, and asked the only question that mattered. "Are you cold?" It was not a declaration. It was not even kindness, not the way the town would have named it. It was smaller than that, and larger too. The kind of question asked by someone who has learned that survival is made of small mercies stacked one on top of another. He answered with a nod, because that was all he had left to give, and she covered him with the good wool blanket from the cedar chest, the one she had been saving for a life she no longer expected to have. What she could not have known, kneeling there in the lantern light with the wind working at the barn boards, was that the man she was warming would still be standing in that same barn seasons later, and that the town which had once pitied her would come to speak her name differently. This is the story of a widow who asked a small question on a cold night, and a wounded man who answered it by never leaving. Josephine Carter woke before the sun on a Tuesday in late October, the way she woke every day now, with the cold already inside the house before she had a chance to keep it out. The stove had gone dark sometime after midnight, and her breath hung pale in the air above the quilt her mother had sewn 30 years before. She lay still for a moment, listening to the wind test the shutters, and then she rose because there was no version of the day that began any other way. There was livestock to feed and wood to split and a debt that did not care whether she was tired. The ranch had a way of asking the same question every morning, and the question was always whether she would still be standing by nightfall. She dressed in the dark, the way she had learned to, her fingers finding buttons by memory rather than light. The dress was the good one, mended twice at the elbow because the other two had worn through past mending. She did not light the lamp until she reached the kitchen, and even then she kept the flame low, because lamp oil cost money, and money was the one thing the ranch did not grow. Outside, the pasture stretched pale and frost-bitten toward the tree line, and somewhere past that, the Whitfield land began, larger and better fenced, and utterly indifferent to her troubles. She had married into 40 acres and buried a husband into 30 of them, and what remained belonged to her in name only, since the bank held the better half of its worth. Her husband, Daniel, had been dead 2 winters now. He had gone quickly, the way strong men sometimes do, felled by a fever that no doctor in 3 counties could explain or reverse. Josephine had buried him on a Thursday in the plot behind the house, under the cedar he had planted the year they married, and she had gone back to work the following morning because the cattle did not understand grief and would not wait for it to pass. The town had been kind at first, in the way towns are kind to fresh widows, with pies left on porches and offers that faded within a season. By the second winter, the pies had stopped coming, and what remained was pity, which Josephine had learned tasted worse than hunger. She fed the chickens first, scattering feed with a hand made rough by 2 years of work meant for 2 people. The rooster watched her with one eye, unimpressed, the way roosters are unimpressed by everything. She moved to the barn next, where the milk cow stood waiting with the patient resentment of an animal accustomed to being milked by someone stronger. Josephine set her forehead against the cow's warm flank and worked in silence, watching her breath rise and disappear, and she allowed herself, for exactly as long as it took to fill the pail, to feel the full weight of being alone. Then she stood, wiped her hands on her apron, and did not allow herself to feel it again for the rest of the day. There was not room in a day like this one for more than a single moment of that kind. The debt collector came at 9, a thin man named Harvey Pruitt, who worked for the bank in town and took no particular pleasure in his errand, though he did not refuse it either. He sat his horse at the edge of the yard rather than dismounting, which Josephine understood as a small mercy. The closest thing to kindness a man in his position could offer. He told her what she already knew, that the note was due in 3 weeks, and that the bank's patience, while real, was not infinite. She told him what she always told him, that she would have it. And he nodded in a way that suggested he did not believe her, but respected her enough not to say so. Not unkindly, but without any hurry, he touched his hat and turned his horse back toward the road, leaving her standing in a yard that suddenly felt smaller than it had that morning. She did not cry. She had found, over 2 winters, that crying accomplished nothing that work could not accomplish better, and so she turned instead to the fence line that needed mending before the cattle found the gap, and wandered onto Whitfield land, where they would be impounded and charged for the trouble. The posts were old, set by Daniel's father before either of them were born, and the wood had gone gray and soft in places where the winters had worked their patient damage. Josephine worked through the morning with a hammer too heavy for her hands and nails that bent as often as they held, and by noon her palms had blistered in the places they always blistered, the same places every week, like the land itself was determined to leave its mark on her. In town that afternoon she overheard what she was not meant to hear, standing at the counter of the Mercantile, while 2 women discussed her in voices they believed were lower than they were. One of them was Mabel Whitfield, wife to the rancher whose land bordered her own, a woman who wore her respectability the way other women wore good coats, visibly and with some pride. Mabel was saying that a woman alone could not be expected to hold 40 acres, that it was neither natural nor wise, and that someone ought to speak to her about selling before the bank did it for her. Josephine paid for her flour without turning around, because she had learned that a woman who turns around gives the town something to remember, and she carried her parcel out to the wagon with her spine set the way her mother had taught her, straight regardless of what it cost. The ride home took the better part of an hour, the wagon wheels finding every rut the recent rain had carved into the road, and Josephine spent the time doing what she always did when the day had been long, which was nothing at all. She did not plan. She did not grieve. She simply watched the fence posts pass and let the cold settle into her hands and did not ask herself, not even once, what she would do if the bank came calling before she found the money. Some things were too large for naming, and the note was one of them, and so she left it where it was, folded up somewhere behind her ribs, and drove the rest of the way home in silence. The light was already failing when she reached the yard, the sky gone the color of a bruise over the western ridge, and she moved quickly now, the way anyone moves when the dark is close and there is still work waiting. She put the horse up first, then carried the flour inside, then went back out to check the barn before full night came down, because a loose latch in the cold could cost her a calf she could not afford to lose. It was there, at the barn door, with the lantern raised and her breath clouding in front of her, that she heard the sound that did not belong to any animal she owned. It was low and ragged and unmistakably human, coming from the shadows near the far stall, where the hay was stacked deep against the winter. Josephine stood very still for a moment, the way a woman stands when she has heard something she cannot yet explain, and is deciding whether courage or caution will win the argument inside her. Then she raised the lantern higher and stepped forward, because whatever was in her barn was hurting, and hurting was a language she had come to understand better than most. The light found him before she was ready for it. A man half buried in the straw, his shirt dark with blood gone old. A ranger's badge catching the lantern glow like something that did not belong to this particular Tuesday at all. She did not scream, and she did not run for help, because there was no one close enough to hear her, and no time to spare if there had been. She only knelt, the way a woman kneels beside something wounded and decides, without quite deciding, that she is not going to leave it there. "Are you cold?" she asked, kneeling in the straw with the lantern raised between them. And it was the only question she could think to ask a man who looked as though the night itself had tried to take him. He answered with a nod, small and slow, the kind of gesture that costs a wounded man more than words would have. Josephine did not ask his name yet. She did not ask what had put the blood on his shirt, or why a ranger had come to be lying in her barn rather than in a doctor's office in town. There would be time for questions later, she told herself. And right now there was only the matter of keeping him alive until morning. She covered him first with the good wool blanket from the cedar chest, the one she had folded away 2 winters before and not touched since. And then she went to work the way her mother had taught her to work, without ceremony and without waste. She cut away the ruined shirt with kitchen shears and found the wound beneath it, a deep furrow along his side that had bled freely but had, by some mercy, missed anything vital. She cleaned it with water boiled on the stove and whiskey she had kept for medicinal purposes and never once for pleasure. And she bound it tight with strips torn from a bedsheet already past its better years. He did not make a sound through any of it, though his jaw tightened once, the way a man's jaw tightens when he has decided that pain is a private matter. By the time she finished, it was past midnight, and she sat back on her heels and studied him properly for the first time. He was younger than she had first guessed, though not young, with a face weathered by sun and short on softness, the kind of face that had learned early not to give much away. The badge pinned to what remained of his shirt read, "Texas Ranger," and beneath it, stitched crudely into the lining, was a single name, Nathan. She said it once, quietly, to see how it sat in the barn air, and something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but close enough to its shadow. Then she banked the barn stove low, set the lantern where its light would not disturb him, and left him to whatever sleep his body could manage. She did not sleep herself. Not truly. She lay in her own bed with the door unlatched, listening for sounds from the barn the way a mother listens for a child's fever to break. And somewhere near dawn she must have drifted, because she woke to gray light and the immediate memory of what waited outside. She dressed quickly and went out with broth she had started before first light, thin but warm, carried in a tin cup with both hands wrapped around it against the cold. He was awake when she reached him, propped against the stall wall, watching the barn door with the wary stillness of a man who had spent his life expecting trouble to arrive before it announced itself. He took the broth without argument, and that more than anything he might have said, told her he had decided to trust her, at least this far. The days that followed took on a shape neither of them spoke aloud, but both understood. Josephine brought food morning and evening, changed the bandage every second day, and asked no more than the wound itself required her to know. Nathan spoke little in return, offering facts the way a man offers coin he can spare and no more. That he had been riding after 2 men wanted for cattle theft near the county line, that the ambush had come from brush he should have checked and hadn't, that his horse had thrown him somewhere past the tree line before bolting for parts unknown. He did not say why he had crawled toward her barn, rather than the road into town, and she did not ask, though she suspected the answer had something to do with a man's unwillingness to be found weak in front of strangers who might remember it later. By the 4th day he was sitting up on his own, and by the 6th he was standing, though the standing cost him more than he let show in his face. Josephine found him one morning near the stall door, testing his weight against the frame. And she said nothing about it, only set down the coffee she'd carried out and let him find his own way back to the hay bale without her hand under his arm. It was the way a man moves when he is not asking for anything, careful and proud and quietly furious at his own limits. And she recognized something of Daniel in it, though she did not say that either. Some things were too large for naming, and grief dressed up as recognition was one of them. Word of the stranger reached town by the end of the first week, the way word always did in a place with more curiosity than population. It came unsurprisingly through Mabel Whitfield, who had heard it from the Pruitt boy, who had seen smoke rising from Josephine's barn at hours no honest barn required smoke. Mabel arrived on a Tuesday afternoon under the pretense of returning a dish borrowed the previous spring, though both women understood the dish was an excuse and had been for some time. She stood in Josephine's kitchen with her gloves still on, which was its own kind of statement, and asked in a voice pitched for concern but shaped like judgment whether it was true that Josephine was keeping a man in her barn. Josephine answered plainly because she had decided somewhere in the last week that plainness was the only armor she had left to wear. She said there was a wounded ranger recovering in her barn, that she had found him half dead and had done what any Christian woman would do, and that she did not intend to explain herself further to anyone who had not offered to help. Mabel's mouth thinned at that, the particular thinning of a woman unaccustomed to being answered rather than apologized to, and she left shortly after with her dish and her opinions equally unresolved. Josephine watched her wagon go down the road and felt, not triumph exactly, but something close to it, the small satisfaction of a woman who has stopped asking permission to survive. That evening, when she brought Nathan his supper, she found him standing at the barn door looking out at the pasture, upright now without the wall to hold him. He had heard some of it, he admitted, the visit and the voices, though not all of it, and he asked in the fewest words the question could take, whether her keeping him there was going to cost her something. Josephine considered the question longer than it perhaps required, watching the last light go gold and then gray over the fence line Daniel's father had built. She told him that everything cost something, and that some costs were worth paying, and that he ought to eat his supper before it went cold. He did not press further, though something in the set of his shoulders eased, the way a man eases when he has been given permission to stay without being asked to say thank you for it. The wind picked up as the light failed completely, carrying the first true bite of the coming winter across the yard, and Josephine pulled her shawl tighter and did not go back inside right away. Nathan stood beside her at the barn door, not touching. The distance between them careful and deliberate, and together they watched the dark come down over land that belonged to her and no one else, at least for now. Neither of them spoke of what the town would say, or what the bank would want, or how long a wounded ranger could reasonably stay in another woman's barn before the staying itself became its own kind of answer. They simply stood, the way two people stand who have not yet found the words for what is happening between them, and let the cold settle around them both, and did not move away from it. By the second week of November, Nathan was no longer a man recovering so much as a man working, and the difference showed itself first in small ways that Josephine noticed before she admitted to noticing. She woke one morning to find the fence line along the north pasture already mended, the gray posts straightened and the wire drawn tight in a way her own hands had never quite managed. She found him near the barn afterward, favoring his side but upright, coiling loose rope with the unhurried patience of a man who intended to finish what he started. She did not thank him at length, because she had learned by then that he did not want thanking, only the quiet acknowledgement that the work had been seen. She only nodded and said the fence looked well built, and watched something small settle in his shoulders at the words. He took to the mornings the way another man might take to prayer, rising before she did, and moving through the chores with a steadiness that asked nothing of her except that she let him do them. He split wood until the pile beside the house grew taller than it had been in 2 winters, and he mended the porch step that had sagged since before Daniel died. And he did all of it without asking whether the work was welcome. Josephine watched him from the kitchen window some mornings, coffee cooling in her hands, and thought that this was a language she had not heard spoken in a long while. A man's love of a place shone entirely through his hands and never once through his mouth. She did not call it love, not yet, not even to herself. But she noticed it the way a person notices weather changing, gradually and then all at once. Supper became the hour they kept without naming it a custom, Nathan washing at the pump before coming to the table, Josephine setting a second plate as though it had always belonged there. Conversation between them stayed spare, the way conversation had always been spare in that house, but it filled in slowly at the edges. A comment about the cattle, a question about the small offerings passed back and forth like coins. Neither of them wanted to spend too freely. One evening she asked him, not quite looking at him, whether he intended to ride on once his side had healed proper. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all, and then he said only that he hadn't decided, and something about the plainness of it satisfied her more than a longer answer would have. "More molasses," she said one night, sliding the jar toward him without being asked. And he looked at her the way a man looks at something he is trying to place, as though the gesture meant more than the sweetness it offered. "I know," she said before he could ask anything further, and that was the whole of the exchange. And it was enough. Some things were too large for naming, and the quiet between them at that table had become one of those things, filling the kitchen the way lamplight fills a room after dark, present without announcing itself. Neither of them reached for more than that. It was, for the moment, exactly the size it needed to be. The gossip in town, meanwhile, had not softened with the passing weeks, and if anything had sharpened, the way gossip does when it is denied the scandal it hoped for. Mabel Whitfield took to mentioning, at church and at the mercantile, and anywhere else a listening ear might be found, that a ranger recovering for 2 weeks in a widow's barn was recovering longer than any wound required. She did not say more than that outright, but she did not need to, because the town was skilled at filling silences with its own imagination. Josephine heard the murmurs when she went in for supplies, felt the particular quiet that fell over a room when she entered it, and carried her chin the same height regardless. She had buried a husband and kept a ranch alone through 2 winters, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that the town's opinion weighed less on her now than it once had. The more immediate trouble arrived not from gossip but from a man named Cooper Reyes, who ran cattle on leased land 2 miles east and had been circling Josephine's property since before Daniel was cold in the ground. He came by on a Thursday afternoon with an offer dressed up as a kindness, suggesting that a woman alone, with debts mounting and winter coming, might do well to sell her acreage before the bank forced worse terms on her. His price was low enough that Josephine understood it for what it was before he finished speaking, and she told him plainly that the land was not for sale. Not to him, and not at that figure. Cooper's smile stayed fixed through her refusal, the kind of smile that did not reach past the teeth, and he said he would ask again. Come spring, when her circumstances might have changed his answer for her. Nathan had been at the woodpile through the whole exchange, close enough to hear it, though he had not come forward or spoken a word. It was only after Cooper's wagon had gone that he crossed the yard, unhurried, and asked her, in his few words, what the man had wanted. Josephine told him, and watched Nathan's jaw set in a way she had not seen since the night she'd found him bleeding in the straw, though he said nothing more than that Cooper Reyes was a man worth watching. He did not offer to handle it for her, and did not suggest she needed handling, and something in that restraint told her more about him than a show of temper would have. He simply went back to the woodpile, and split the next log harder than the one before it, and said no more about it that evening. The following week, when Cooper's men were seen riding the fence line at dusk, closer to Josephine's boundary than any honest business required. Nathan was already there before they reached the gate. He said little to them, only stood at the fence with his hat low and his stance easy in the way of a man who has stood between danger and something he intends to protect more times than he could count. The men turned back without incident, and word of it reached town by the next morning, carried this time not by Mabel, but by one of Cooper's own hands, who mentioned it at the saloon with something closer to respect than complaint. Josephine did not ask Nathan about it directly, only noticed that Cooper Reyes did not come calling again that month, not unkindly, but without any hurry. The trouble had simply stopped arriving at her gate. The evenings had grown colder by then, cold enough that Nathan took to sitting on the porch after supper, rather than returning straight to the barn, and Josephine took to joining him there, a shawl over her shoulders and 2 cups of coffee going lukewarm between them. They did not speak of Cooper Reyes, or of the gossip in town, or of the fact that his side had long since healed enough to ride on if he chose to. They spoke instead of small things, the weather likely to come, a cow due to calve before the frost set hard, the particular blue the sky had turned that evening over the western ridge. It was on one such evening, the porch boards cold beneath them and the lamp burning low in the window behind, that his hand came to rest beside hers on the railing, not over it, and neither of them moved it away. The gesture went unremarked by either of them, at least aloud, but Josephine felt it the way a person feels a change in weather before the first drop falls, a shift too quiet to name and too certain to ignore. She thought of Daniel then, briefly, the way she still did most days, and found the thought did not ache the way it once had, softened instead by something that had grown up quietly alongside the grief rather than replacing it. Nathan said nothing, only sat with his hand beside hers in the cold, watching the same darkening sky she was watching, and the silence between them held more than either of them had yet found words for. The fire in the house had gone low behind them, and the wind moved through the pines beyond the pasture, and neither of them went inside until the cold finally insisted on it. Some things were too large for naming, and this, she understood now, was becoming one of them. December came in hard that year, the way December always did in that part of the country, with frost that silvered the fence posts by dawn, and a wind that found every gap in a wall not built carefully enough. Josephine woke on a Wednesday to the coldest morning yet, the water in the wash basin skinned with ice, and she dressed quickly and went out to find Nathan already at the barn, blanketing the horses against a cold that had arrived earlier than the almanac had promised. He had taken to sleeping in the barn still, though the reasons for it had long since stopped being about recovery, and she found herself, more mornings than not, walking out before full light simply to see that he was there. It had become a habit she did not examine too closely, the way a person avoids naming a thing for fear that naming it will make it require an answer. The bank's note came due that week, and Josephine had spent the autumn finding the money in pieces too small to feel like relief on their own, egg money and milk money, and the sale of 2 calves she had meant to keep through winter. Nathan had added to it without being asked, taking work where he found it, mending fences for neighbors who paid in coin rather than gossip, and setting what he earned on the kitchen table without comment, the way a man sets down something he does not want thanked for. Harvey Pruitt rode out on the appointed day expecting, Josephine suspected, to find her short again, and instead she counted the full amount into his hand at the edge of the yard. He looked at the sum, and then at the barn behind her, and then at her, and said only that the bank would note the note as settled. Not unkindly, but without any hurry, he touched his hat and rode back toward town, and Josephine stood in the yard a long moment before she let herself believe it. That evening, she found Nathan at the porch railing where he so often stood now, his hand resting near the wood the way it had rested near hers weeks before, and she told him the debt was paid. He did not smile outright because he rarely did, but something eased in his face all the same. The way a man's face eases when a weight he had quietly carried alongside her is finally set down. She thanked him then, plainly, the way she had learned he preferred, and he said only that the ranch was worth keeping, and that some things were worth the work, regardless of whose name was on the deed. She understood, hearing it, that he had stopped thinking of the ranch as hers alone some time ago, though neither of them had said so directly. The admission sat between them on the cold porch, quiet and complete, needing nothing further to explain it. The town's judgment, which had never fully quieted, began that same week to soften into something closer to acceptance, though it came the way most town opinions came, sideways and without apology. Mabel Whitfield, of all people, was the one to signal it, stopping Josephine outside the mercantile to remark, in a voice pitched carefully between concession and pride, that the Carter Ranch looked better tended than it had in years. It was not an apology, not by any measure, but it was as close to one as the town intended to offer, and Josephine understood that for what it was and accepted it without comment. Cooper Reyes, for his part, had stopped riding near her fence line altogether, having learned what the town now seemed to be learning as well, that the widow Carter was no longer a woman standing alone. The silence that had once judged her had begun, slowly, to make room for her instead. It was on a Tuesday, near the middle of December, with snow threatening and a sky gone the color of pewter, that the true turn came. Quiet as everything between them had always been. Josephine had gone out to the barn near dusk to check the latch, the same errand that had brought her to him in the first place, and found Nathan there brushing down the horse he had claimed, in all but paper, as his own. She stood in the doorway a moment, watching him work, and thought of how much had changed since the night she had knelt in that same straw with a lantern and a question. "Are you cold?" she asked him now, the words nearly identical to the ones she had spoken that first night, though everything about their meaning had shifted in the months between. He set down the brush and turned to her and said that he was not anymore, and that he did not intend to be again if it was within his power to prevent it. She understood, hearing it, that he was not speaking only of the weather, and neither, she realized, had she been. The barn held its familiar smells around them, hay and horse and the particular cold that came off a winter evening, and neither of them moved for a moment, letting the words settle the way words settle in a quiet room. His hand came to rest beside hers on the stall rail, not over it the way it always rested, careful and deliberate and entirely certain in its restraint. She did not pull away, and he did not press further, and the moment held itself together on nothing more than the two of them standing still in the same cold that had first brought them together. It was enough. It had always, she understood now, been enough. He told her, in the fewest words the telling required, that he did not intend to ride on when spring came, that he had thought of little else through the autumn and had arrived, finally, at an answer he was certain of. Josephine asked him what had decided it, half expecting some grand accounting of feelings she knew he would never give her, and he only said that a man knows where he belongs by the work his hands want to do, and that his hands, for the first time in longer than he could remember, wanted to stay. It was not a declaration in the way romance novels wrote declarations, no dropping to one knee, no flowery promise offered under a rising moon. It was simply a man telling a woman, in the plain language they had built together over a season of small gestures, that he had chosen to remain. She found she did not need more than that, and told him so, and he nodded once, the way a man nods when a thing that mattered has finally been settled. The snow began that night, soft at first and then steady, and by morning the ranch lay under a clean white quiet that muffled even the sound of the wind. Nathan was at the barn before Josephine woke, as he always was now, and she found him there with the animals fed and the fire already going, the ordinary rhythm of a life that had, without either of them quite marking the moment, become shared rather than solitary. She stood in the doorway, watching him a moment longer than the errand required, the way a woman watches something she has stopped being afraid to want. Some things were too large for naming, and this, finally, no longer needed to be. It had simply become the shape of her days, steady and certain as the snow falling outside. The pines beyond the pasture stood heavy with new snow by the following week, their branches bending low under weight they had carried every winter before this one, and would carry every winter after. The fire in the house burned through each evening the way it always had, indifferent to the two people who now sat before it rather than one, and the horses moved in the corral with the same unbothered patience they had always shown, unaware of anything having changed at all. Smoke rose from the chimney into a sky gone dark early, the way it did every December, curling upward and disappearing the way smoke always disappears, leaving no mark of the warmth it carried. The river at the edge of the property had begun to skin over with ice, slow and certain, the water beneath still moving though the surface had gone still and quiet. The world had not paused to notice what had happened in that barn, and it did not need to. It simply continued, the way the world always continues, carrying the small, enormous changes of ordinary people forward into whatever came next. And that was the story of Josephine Carter and Nathan Reyes, a widow who arrived at her own barn door with nothing but a lantern and a question, and a wounded ranger who answered it by staying for good, long after the wound that first brought him there had healed and been forgotten by everyone but the two of them. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this one. Thank you.